I'm going to divide this into two basic parts. The first part will be much shorter than the second part. The first part is a very basic lecture with PowerPoint slides to try to bring everyone up to speed to understand the more academic talk that I have in the second part. This is Europe in 2012. A lot of very familiar states on here with Spain and France, Italy and Germany, Great Britain, Turkey over here, and Greece. But that's not the Europe that we're talking about today. 600 years ago, 550 years ago, for the events that we're going to talk about, this is what Europe would have looked like. Notice that the center of Europe is an absolute mess. This is a vast oversimplification of what's really going on here, where you have literally hundreds of very small principalities, dukedoms, small republics, you name it, and there's a political structure that exists through this area. Extending into northern Italy, there is no such thing as Germany. There is no such thing as Italy. You look over here with Spain does not exist. It's broken up into smaller states. France is actually a simplification of the situation in France, which is also broken up into much smaller parts. The players that I'm going to talk about today are Venice. Today, Venice is famous for gondoliers and pizza boxes, quite frankly, and very, very beautiful pictures. In the 1400s and before, Venice is in possession of a large maritime empire that stretches down the Adriatic Sea along the coast of the Dalmatian coast and into Greece, which is over here. I'm going to talk to you today about Byzantium, which is the remnants of the old Eastern Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in the East continues up until really 1461, but the remnants of it are here. When I talk about the Byzantine Empire in the 1440s, you're talking about more or less Constantinople and very, very little else. It's entirely surrounded by the Ottoman Turks. I'll talk about the Papal States, which is here in the center of the Italian peninsula. The Papal State is the possession of the Pope. In the 1450s, there is one more or less Christian faith, the Catholic Church, which will extend across Europe. Martin Luther is not going to be around for another 60 or 70 years. This is an age before print, so when I talk about Biondo Flavio and his text, there is no publisher, so to speak, of his works. These are all handwritten copies of whatever he writes down. If someone likes it, maybe they'll copy it by hand as well. I have a close-up. This is the Italian peninsula in the 1494, where you'll see a very big papal state here. The Kingdom of Naples we'll talk about a bit. Florence I'm not going to talk about today, but most of my research focuses on Florence. My book is on Florence. My dissertation was on Florence. Important to note, this is the Kingdom of Aragon, and I'll refer to King Alfonso the Magnanimous, or King Alfonso of Naples, King Alfonso of Aragon. It's all the same person. The ruler of this sliver of land, not really a sliver, also will be in possession of this island and all of southern Italy by the time the events in my talk are discussed. Religion, geography, politics. A brief word on the Crusades. This talk is about how Biondo Flavio legitimates or attempts to legitimate a new crusade in the 1440s. The Crusades today are famous from movies. They're famous from things like Robin Hood. Robin Hood famously will step in England while good King Richard the Lionheart is off fighting crusade in the Holy Land. Then the wicked Sheriff Nottingham comes and Robin Hood a fox will try to make sure that the poor aren't too badly oppressed. That will happen much, much earlier than what I'm talking about today. The Crusades begin more or less at the end of the 1000s, the end of the 11th century. And as an idea, as something that people try to actually do, this will continue into the 1500s. The last successful Crusades in the West will be long over by the late 1300s, by the 1400s, by the 1500s. But this idea of successful Crusades from the 1000s, from the 1100s, from the 1200s, will continue in Western thought. I also want to talk, before I give my lecture today, about humanism. Humanism is the predominant intellectual movement of the Italian Renaissance. Just like today, the predominant intellectual movement in the United States, you could argue, would be the natural sciences, perhaps business schools. During the 1400s, it is humanism. What does that mean? Humanism is a study of the humanities. You get the name humanities from humanism. Humanists are concerned with the study of history, poetry, grammar, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. Moral philosophy being a fancy, long-winded way of saying ethics. They're obsessed with the study of antiquity. First Roman antiquity, but then over time, more and more people are going to learn Greek. So they'll return to the original Greek of Plato. See a lot of students here. The original Greek of Plato, original Greek of Aristotle. But this will take time. At first, it's an obsession about Roman antiquity and then Greek antiquity. This will dominate the intellectual life in Italy and then all of Europe for centuries. So what do they work? Why is humanism not a famous intellectual movement to most people, unlike the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution? Why? Or even scholasticism in the medieval period. Why is humanism not so well known? Traditionally, they've been overlooked in the canon of great Western authors. The literature, as I've called it here, is a lost literature. There have been 2 scholars who have published articles calling it, quote, a lost literature. One has called it a lost continent. What does that mean? That means that you can do things like this. This is a book. It's probably 700 pages long. It's one of 6 volumes that look exactly like this. 2 different columns, and it just lists. And that's all that it does is list. What is the list of? Paul Oscar Christelli went to Padua, or Padua. He went to the seminary library, and he went to hundreds of other libraries, went through handwritten catalogs of what type of handwritten manuscripts from before 1450 exist in that place. He spent his entire life, 50 years, doing this. Library after library after library after library. It's unbelievable. But then he lists and published what you find. If you go to the Biblioteca del Seminario, or the seminary library, you go to this particular collection, you go to number 13, you find a 15th century manuscript with pictures. Blondus, that's what we're going to talk about today. Biondo Flavio, in Latin his name is Blondus, which means blonde hair. Roma Triumphus to Pius II. And it continues. Thousands of pages like this. It's called a lost literature because this man went through and did all this. Most of these texts haven't been published in 500 years. The document that I'm going to talk about today, Biondo's Decades of History from the Fall of the Roman Empire, was last published in 1531, so about 500 years ago. And for those of you who are interested, Padua is here, which is in northern Italy. If you take a train to Venice, Padua will be the last stop before you go to Venice. And it's famous for its university. So why is this situation the way it is? Why do you have such an enormous amount of material that has never been, in essence, published? That in order to see it, you would have to read Latin, in some cases of time, but almost always Latin, and you'd have to have access to special collections in a place like Padua. Why? Maybe it's their focus. They're interested in things like history and ethics. That is not what people today in the 20th century are looking for when they find interesting texts from the past. Usually they're interested in, oh look, here's a new innovative thought on biology. Here's a new innovative thought on business. Not here's a new innovative thought on ethics. So maybe it's not particularly teleologically pleasing. Teleological means looking for something to find the present. Another idea is maybe it's the nationalist focus of 19th century historians. The great canon of Western authors that we're all familiar with, people like Dickens, or we decide Homer goes in the canon, this author does not. Chaucer gets to go into the canon, another author does not. In Italian, it'd be Boccaccio, and then Machiavelli. These people are famous writers, other writers are not. The people that made those decisions largely lived in the 1880s, 1890s, the early 20th century. And they had biases when they made these decisions. One bias was that in order to express the national genius, in order to write and be considered a genius, you had to write in your native tongue. If you wrote in a second language, you were in somehow stunting the national genius. So if you're Italian and you write in Latin, you're not expressing the Italian national genius. You are in some way stunting the growth of the Italian national genius. So since all these people write in Latin, they don't get into the canon, but Machiavelli, who does write in Italian, he gets it. There's no right answer here. It's just a question. Why should anyone care? Most of the classical texts that you're familiar with get rediscovered or studied in this period. The canon of antiquity, the hundreds and hundreds of books that survived from antiquity, would not survive without these people. In terms of the study of history, these people, some person like Biondo Flavio, and there'll be a very brief reference in my paper to, he's often credited as being the first modern historian. What that means is he's the first person that has an historical question and looks at multiple sources and compares them. Says this source says this source says this one's older than that one, so maybe this one's more reliable. And then I've given you a variety of others. As you have more texts from antiquity, it becomes harder and harder to say the ancient had all knowledge because the ancients don't agree with one another. So if they have all knowledge, but then they say contradictory things, it doesn't work. So it frees up thought. Education, you still have liberal arts colleges. My first teaching job when I was an undergraduate in college was to teach at a charter school where they wanted a traditional Western education. And what they meant by that is they wanted me to come and teach 3rd through 6th graders Latin. They would like Greek to be taught, but they couldn't find someone to teach Greek. And that was a humanist education. They wanted them to have Latin at a very young age so that they could learn ethics. So even into, that was 2001? Yes, 2001. You still have examples of humanist education. And the humanist, I mean, it's kind of an outlier now, but until the late 1800s, 500 years, the humanists had a run. It was humanist education or nothing. A little bit about Biondo Flavio, as arguably the greatest name in the history of time. He's an Italian intellectual that works as a secretary for several popes. As a secretary, he is in charge of writing papal bulls. So an official proclamation from the Pope. The Pope will say, I need to write a proclamation on X. And then they assign a secretary to write it, and the Pope signs their name. So he does that. He'll do diplomatic missions for the Pope. The Council of Ferrara Florence, which I'll talk to today, is a decree reuniting the Greek and Latin churches. Biondo Flavio will write the decree of reunification. He'll write a ton of historical works in Latin that are cited for centuries. Biondo's Fourth Crusade account that I'll talk today is last referred to in a historical work in the 1920s. It's the 4th edition of the History of Venice, but it has a footnote to Biondo Flavio. And he's credited with being the first kinds of all sorts of silly things, which I'll list some of them. Here's a picture of him. This is what a later writer decides he looks like. How you get likenesses of people in the 1400s is when somebody's writing by hand, copying their manuscript out, they will draw a picture of the author, whom they might know, whom they might not know, in the big O that begins the book. And that's where something like that will come from. There was a big O when someone drew his picture, whether you know him or not. And then the next person to copy that text says, oh, he drew his picture, he must have seen it, so I'll just copy that too. This is his tomb in Rome, where you can see his real name is Biondo Flavio Forliviensi, which means Flavio Biondo Flavio. And I thought that I would leave this map up while I read my paper because I refer to a lot of geographical places, so the greatest 20th century historian of the Crusades, Stephen Runciman, famously wrote that, quote, "There was never a greater crime against humanity than the Fourth Crusade." Runciman blamed the Venetians for diverting the Crusade from the Holy Land to Christian cities in the East, accusing the Venetians of, quote, blackmail and duping the French Crusaders, even if it was a, quote, howling mob of French and Flemings who sacked Constantinople and ceased their plunder only to, quote, murder or to rape. More recent historiography has taken a less judgmental approach, and the Venetian Crusaders, as well as their French allies, regained their piety, even as they maintained their opportunism. Historians continue to rightly view the sack of Constantinople in 1204 as an important development in the history of the Crusades, as well as Greek and Latin relations more generally. But the sack and events leading up to it are no longer viewed as treacheries, perpetuated by greedy villains who cared nothing for the irremovable stain that they placed on medieval Christianity. In the tumultuous 1430s, 1440s, and 1450s, the humanist Biondo Flavio wrote 3 separate accounts of the Fourth Crusade, none of which betray the slightest hint that he viewed the event as morally questionable. Biondo was a leading papal secretary, one of the most widely read and influential historians of the 15th century. Historians have credited him with creating the periodic concept of the Renaissance, which means the idea that you have a medieval past, a Renaissance past, and something after that originates with Biondo Flavio. They credit him with being the first medieval historian, so the first person who takes an interest in something after Roman history, and with fathering modern antiquarianism, so like modern archaeology. At a time when the papacy began reasserting itself into the disaster of the Great Schism being a year of about a 40-year period where there's 2 and then 3 popes, as the Byzantine Empire crumbled before the armies of the Ottoman Turk, the Byzantine Empire was not always just a little city. And as the Italian city-states struggled to reconcile their differences and end interminable peninsular warfare, Biondo used the Fourth Crusade to promote and justify a new crusade under papal banners in the East. Biondo's narratives are particularly striking because he wrote no less than 3 of them at different times in different works for different audiences. Shortly after the conclusion of the Council of Florence in 1438-39, Biondo's first narrative of the Fourth Crusade, published in his Decades of History from the Decline of the Roman Empire, or the Decades for short, argued that the present rulers in Byzantium were tyrants, a term in the 15th century that meant Byzantine rulers lacked a legal claim to their lands and could be justly attacked. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but a tyrant today is a very loose term for anyone who rules wickedly. In the 15th century, a tyrant is a very specific term that means you have no legal justification for the lands that you rule. The legitimate rulers of Byzantium were the heirs to the Fourth Crusaders, particularly the Venetians and the Pope. Latin Christians under the banner of Pope Eugenius IV, therefore, had reason and right to fight and conquer lands in the East. Nearly 10 years later, in 1453, Biondo used the Fourth Crusade in a different treatise dedicated to King Alfonso of Aragon in Naples. So remember, this man will rule this part, this island, as well as southern Italy. This time, Biondo argued that the king could extend his maritime holdings to include Byzantium, by then a fallen empire with no legal ruler. Not by coincidence, Biondo's work arrived in Naples at the same time as a papal diplomat urged Alfonso to embark on a new crusade to retake Constantinople. The next year, 1454, Biondo included a final account of the Fourth Crusade in the historical compendium of Venetian history. The narrative retained the same arguments from Biondo's Decades. The 2 narratives are virtually identical, and arrived in Venice shortly after the conclusion of the Peace of Lodi. Once again, Biondo's narrative reinforced papal diplomacy, which then sought to capitalize on this peace agreement and send a new crusade to the East. There, papal armies would take back what were, according to Biondo's narrative of the Fourth Crusade, rightly Latin territories. Biondo's narratives add a fascinating piece to the emerging scholarly puzzles of early modern Crusade literature and the uses of humanist literature to serve political and diplomatic purposes in the present. Norman Housley and Kenneth Sutton conclusively argued that the crusading ideal and practice continued long after the more traditional endpoint of the Crusades at the end of the 13th century. Housley and James Hankins have both investigated the large body of surviving crusading texts from this later period and reached general conclusions about the typical structure and content of these works. Nancy Bazaha, Margaret Meserve, and Robert Schwoibel examined the changing view of the Ottoman Turks in the writings of 15th century humanists. Meserve focused on historical writings in particular and argued that prominent humanist historians, including Biondo Flavio, deliberately shaped their historical narratives to make arguments for the present. Meserve's arguments fit into a growing body of scholarship that looks at the role of contemporary forces in shaping historical narratives of the past, despite humanist protestations to be concerned only for the truth. So everything that I talk about today, if you were to ask Biondo Flavio, how do you write history? He'd say, well, history is the study of true things. I'm only concerned with the truth, which is not accurate. Biondo's three accounts of the Fourth Crusade open a window into another part of the story, the pivotal role of diplomacy and diplomatic ends in shaping history writing and humanist texts more generally. For Biondo, all three of his narratives of the Fourth Crusade provide an historical model for his contemporaries, potential crusaders all, to emulate in the present. However, more than just a rhetorical exercise, Biondo constructed a legal argument for men who heeded the Pope's calls to take up the cross against the Ottoman Turks, to take and hold lands in the East. The legitimation for their actions all began 250 years earlier with the Fourth Crusade. Scholars have long known the major historical sources, actors, and developments of the Fourth Crusade, even as they've debated the interpretation of the whole. In 1198, Pope Innocent III issued a call for a new crusade to retake Jerusalem. In 1201, several French nobles reached an agreement with Venice to secure transport for themselves and their armies to Egypt, which would be their staging ground for the push to Jerusalem. So the idea is, so the Fourth Crusade, first of all, is happening about 250 years before Biondo was writing about it. So by the time of Biondo Flavio, the Fourth Crusade is already 250 years old. So the idea of the Fourth Crusade is you'll have all these crusaders come to Venice, and then you'll sail down into Egypt over here, and then you'll push over land into the Holy Land. But you have to have boats to get there. In 1203, a principal crusading noble died, and it became clear that the remaining nobles had vastly overestimated the numbers they could inspire to take the cross. Subsequently, the crusading army arrived in Venice with too few men and too little money to arm or pay for the fleet prepared by the Venetians. While the Crusaders awaited more money and men, the Venetians and Crusaders made two agreements. So you have a situation where the crusading host has made an agreement with the Venetians. The Venetians will supply boats. The crusading host will pay for these boats. But when the Crusaders arrive, they don't have enough money to pay for the boats that have already been made, and they don't have enough people to go on the boats that have already been made. So they have to make a deal. In exchange for post-trumpet payment on the Crusaders' debts, the nobles and their armies agreed to assist the Venetians in quelling an uprising in Zara, now Zadar in modern Croatia, but at that time a city within the Venetian Maritime Empire. At roughly the same time, a young Alexius, nephew of the Byzantine emperor, arrived in Venice offering money, men, reunion of the Greek and Latin churches, and other promises to the Venetians and the French nobles in exchange for their help deposing his uncle and placing him on the Byzantine throne. All agreed to Alexius' terms, and the fleet sailed. So what they agreed to do is, instead of paying for the boats, they're going to help them put down an uprising in Zadar over here. And while they're making this deal, Alexius IV from the Byzantine emperor shows up and says, how about you help me take back my throne from my uncle? And they say, okay, we'll help you with that too. Improbable and controversial successes followed. The Christian city of Zara was taken and looted by the Christian crusading army. They turned to Constantinople. The Crusaders showed the boy Alexius before the walls of the great city, but he was rejected by the city's inhabitants. The siege of the city began, and the Byzantine Emperor Alexius III fled the city. The Crusaders' Alexius began ruling the city jointly with his father Isaac, whom Alexius III had deposed and imprisoned years earlier. The boy Alexius, now Alexius IV, sought to gain support for his rule and that of his father Isaac, now Isaac II. Isaac II, meanwhile, sought to meet his son's agreement with the Crusaders. Over time, Isaac II began to default on payments. The Greek Murtzuphlus, a shadowy figure from a humble background, began to gain power in Constantinople and voiced constant opposition to the Crusaders. Isaac II died. Murtzuphlus led a coup against Alexius IV, and the boy emperor had him killed. Biondo claims that he led Alexius into the deepest depths of the passages and strangled him, broke his neck personally before going back home. The Crusaders offered a cash settlement to Murtzouphilus, now known as Alexius V, in exchange for their departure from the outskirts of Constantinople. Alexius V rejected the agreement, and the Crusaders prepared to attack Constantinople a second time. The Crusaders sacked, and Alexius V fled the city in April 1204. Baldwin of Flanders was elected emperor. The Latin kingdoms, as they became known, lasted in Constantinople until the Greeks retook the city in 1261, establishing the Palaeologians, the last ruling dynasty of the Byzantine Empire. Today, historians base their study of these events on a myriad of major and minor Greek and Latin sources, especially the history of the Greek patrician Nicetas Criniatis, and the chronicle of the French noble Geoffrey of Bourgogne, and the chronicle of Robert of Clary, who was a soldier in the Crusading army. These sources are also supplemented by a mixture of long and short, reliable and unreliable, surviving Latin and Greek chronicles and archival documents. Biondo Flavio, of course, did not have access to the full range of sources available to modern historians, and either out of necessity or convenience relied on the Cretan humanist Lorenzo de Monachis' Chronicle of Venetian deeds from the founding of the city to 1354 for his own narrative of the Fourth Crusade. Because today, historians have done things like Paul Oscar Christel did with the massive book and list that I showed. They've searched everywhere for any source on the Fourth Crusade that survives. And so today, if you're interested in the Fourth Crusade and you have the languages, you can read hundreds of surviving texts. But Biondo Flavio, again, lives in an age before any of this is possible. He lives in an age where if you have the book, somebody wrote it down by hand. So he's severely limited in what he can look at for the history of the Fourth Crusade. De Monachis' account was, after all, the preferred history of Venice among Venetian patricians during the mid-15th century. Biondo also, more than likely, consulted the Venetian Doge Andrea Dandolo's chronicles and certainly a third or more unknown documents. Undoubtedly, Biondo obtained a copy of Lorenzo de Monachis' chronicle, possibly the chronicle of Andrea Dandolo as well, through Biondo's multiple friendships with Venetian patricians. As early as 1423, Biondo sought the patronage of the learned Venetian patrician Francesco Barbaro after a pro-Milanese faction of cities overtook Biondo's hometown of Forli and banished him from the city. So here's Milan, and Milan will have attacked Forli, which is here where Biondo grew up, and so Biondo would flee to Venice under the protection of Francesco Barbaro because Venice is fighting war against Milan. The following year, Barbaro procured Venetian citizenship for Biondo, his brother, and Biondo's children. Given Barbaro and Lorenzo de Monachis' shared connections to Crete and correspondence, it seems plausible that Barbaro originally brought the work to Biondo's attention. Yet, perhaps Biondo obtained it through one of his numerous other Venetian friends and patrons. In the late 1420s, Biondo traded service under Francesco Barbaro for another Venetian patrician, Barbaro's father-in-law, Pietro Loredana. By 1432, Biondo had attached himself to yet another Venetian, Gabriele Candomar, who had become Pope Eugenius IV in 1431. Biondo was a favorite of Eugenius IV, rising to the rank of apostolic secretary in 1436 and handling delicate diplomatic matters for him throughout his papacy, including diplomatic missions to Venice. Eugenius' death in 1447 did not stop Biondo's continual quest for Venetian patronage, as evidenced by Biondo's attempt to write an official Latin history of Venice in his final unfinished work, The History of the Venetian People. These strong personal and professional ties made Venetian historical works easily accessible to Biondo in an age before mass copies and printing. These friendships also influenced Biondo's version of the Fourth Crusade. Biondo wrote his first narrative of the Fourth Crusade in the aftermath of the Council of Ferrara Florence, an ecumenical council that began in Ferrara in 1438, moved to Florence in 1439, and did not actually conclude until 1442. So this is a council that will start up here and then move down to Florence. The council famously brought the ephemeral reunification of the Greek and Latin churches in July 1439 after the Greek delegation, including the Greek emperor and patriarch, so the head of the political structure of Byzantium and the head of the Church of Byzantium, agreed to place their church under the Pope and to concede most theological disagreements to the Latin point of view. The agreement was finalized, but it was never accepted by the Greeks upon the delegation's return home. So famously, the Greeks will return and the Greeks will revolt. The Greek population revolt when they find out what leaders were. The agreement was finalized, but it was never accepted by the Greeks upon the delegation's return home. In fact, John Palaeologus never actually published the decrees of union in his lands. Nevertheless, from the papal point of view, these decrees still stood throughout the 1440s, regardless of what's going on in Greece. The Pope sees this union as done, and he'll act accordingly. Indeed, Pope Eugenius IV proceeded throughout 1442, 1443, and 1444 to gather his forces to aid the Greek sheep, newly returned to the papal flock against the oncoming Turkish wolves. The Council of Ferrara-Florence was possible because of Greek expectation for aids against the Ottoman Turk and Pope Eugenius IV's desire to assist them. The Greeks had been fishing through Europe for military aid for decades, occasionally using their learned links to Greek antiquity as a lure. In the summer of 1426, the Greek diplomat Andreas Chrysogonos negotiated an agreement to transport a Greek delegation 700 strong to discuss the reunion of the churches, as well as 300 crossbowmen and 2 ships to protect Constantinople in the emperor's absence. The next decade was not conducive to union, with Eugenius IV fleeing an uprising in Rome in 1434. The population of Rome will rise up against the Pope because the Pope's not a member of the right family that happens to be ruling Rome at that time. So Eugenius will hide as a peasant and sail up the river and land in Florence, where he'll stay for the next 10 years or so. Arguing with Conciliarists at the Council of Basel throughout the 1430s and fighting endless wars against Milan during the same period. The deal was delayed. Not until 1437 did the Greek envoys decide that they would negotiate with the Pope and not the Council of Basel. The Greeks offered Pope Eugenius IV the same terms agreed to by Martin V, and Eugenius IV enthusiastically agreed. In 1438, the Greeks arrived and after months of debate concluded the ecclesiastical union on July 9, 1439. Biondo, in fact, was a key player in the Council of Ferrara-Florence, to which his many passages about the council and his decades attest. There is an oversized emphasis on this council throughout the decade, passage after passage after passage, about the specifics of theological debates. As a papal favorite and powerful apostolic secretary, Biondo perhaps spoke for the hopes of most members of the papal court in one particularly revealing passage of the decades. At the end of his account of the Council of Florence, Biondo described the Ethiopian envoys. He claimed that one of them said, quote, "If the crusade would be pressed forward with hard work in whatever way was fitting, the result would be that the greatest and innumerable multitude of peoples of the Christian religion and of the Christian name would be revived in dignity, and afterwards, through the power of their people, it would be easy to drive the barbarian enemies of Christ from Jerusalem and the holy places of Syria, which they have occupied for so long." In 1442, Pope Eugenius IV had accomplished the reunion of the far-flung Christian churches under the papal banner, a banner he intended to carry eastward to the Holy Land. On the way, just as in 1204, the Latin Crusaders, lured again by the reconciliation of the Greek to Latin churches, would grant aid to the Emperor of Constantinople. At around the same time, Biondo completed his first narrative of the Fourth Crusade. Biondo's version of the Fourth Crusade provided a model to emulate, but even more importantly, it provided a legal basis and theoretical justification for the battles ahead. Biondo's narrative of the Fourth Crusade consistently reworked and added to his major source to construct a narrative to prove papal diplomacy and papal crusading efforts. In particular, Biondo argued that the Crusaders of the past were heroes who possessed divine approval to establish legal government over tyrannical Greeks. Implicitly, therefore, new Crusaders setting forth to the east could take back what was rightfully theirs. At the heart of Biondo's claim lay conceptions of tyranny and just war, common among contemporary thinkers. For early 15th century humanists, tyrannis was a word that pertained less to debates over the worth of republican versus monarchical rule, and more about a government's right to exist based on its quality and historical claim to rule. A tyrant came to power illegally, was deposed by a legitimate authority, or ruled so wickedly that she lost a legal claim to rule. Most importantly, a tyrant could be legally resisted, even killed, and his or her lands seized by a person with a legal claim to them. So if you have a tyrant, you can legally depose that tyrant and take their lands. Moreover, a person who fought against a tyrant partially fulfilled the concept of just war as laid out by the church father Augustine. According to this influential thinker, a just war had 4 basic criteria. A just reason must underlay the war. The war must be defensive. A legitimate authority must sanction the war. The people fighting the war must have the right motivations. Such was Biondo's argument about the Fourth Crusade. Biondo's narrative of the Fourth Crusade argued that the Crusaders fought on behalf of legal claimant to the Byzantine throne against an illegal tyrant. This portrayal enabled Biondo to meet the first criteria of a just war, namely that a just reason underlay the Crusaders' bellicose actions. The key to this argument was to portray the Crusaders' ally, Alexius IV, as a legitimate ruler, and to portray the Crusaders' opponents, Alexius III and Alexius V, the ruler before and the ruler after him, as illegitimate. Biondo made these points explicit. As soon as Alexius IV met the crusading army at Zara, the young man's Alexius III was described as a, quote, fratricide and a tyrant, tyrannus, words not found in Biondo's source. So you can read where Biondo takes this narrative from. Lorenzo de Monachis has a very, very similar account, and you can see what Biondo adds to his account to make it his own. And what he makes it, how he makes it his own, is by adding a word like tyrant and fratricide. Alexius V, also known as Murtzuphlus, fared even worse. Biondo's source for the relevant passages described Murtzuphlus. So Lorenzo de Monachis described Murtzuphlus. He calls him a commoner, bold, and clever. Biondo adds that Murtzuphlus was weak, had an evil mind, was eager for tyranny, which is ad tyrannidem ad hellebat, which literally means he's panting after tyranny. Moreover, Murtzuphlus was a fake emperor, a tyrant, and a bad man. Malignus homo. In addition to making Murtzuphlus a villain, Biondo's characterization destroyed any claim that Murtzuphlus may have possessed rule over Constantinople. By labeling Murtzuphlus a tyrant and a fake emperor, Biondo argued that the Venetians and their allies were deposing an unlawful usurper rather than a legitimate ruler. Moreover, Biondo pointed out that both men with a legal claim to the imperial throne, Alexius IV and his father Alexius II, were dead. The Venetian and French set out to do the just act of deposing a tyrant and legally conquering a land to which they possessed a claim to rule. Biondo took other less explicit steps to argue that the Crusaders fought on behalf of a man whose lawful claim to rule had been illegally usurped. Biondo did not use a portion from Lorenzo de Monachis' chronicle that related how the Crusaders demanded that Alexius III resign as emperor in favor of his nephew Alexius IV, but Alexius III refused to do so. So Lorenzo de Monachis relates a story in which the Crusaders are arriving at Constantinople. They have Alexius IV on their boat, so they sail up around the walls of the city and show Alexius IV and say, "Here is your rightful ruler. Throw down the tyrant in your walls and take your." And all the people in the city say, "No, we're not doing this." Biondo cuts all of that from his history. In its place, Biondo input a passage claiming that the people of Crete gave up their island to the boy Alexius by public decree. So Crete is down here. So what Biondo removes is a passage that casts doubt onto whether Alexius IV was a legal ruler, and he puts this passage about Crete being given to him. The language of public decree suggests an expression of popular consent consistent with the legal means of acquiring territory in the absence of a ruling overlord, as was the case on Crete, since Biondo had already shown Alexius III to be a tyrant. The boy Alexius, in turn, gave his new legally acquired lands to his relative Boniface, granting the crusading army a claim to them, especially in the event of Alexius' death. So then Biondo says, Alexius gives Crete to the Crusaders. This is the beginning of an argument about the claim to these lands that Biondo makes. In short, Biondo's narrative replaced the section in his source in which lands were refused to the Crusaders with a different section in which lands were willingly given to the Crusaders' ally. Alexius' subjects recognized him as a legitimate authority by their action, and he in turn transferred his claim to his relative, the Crusader Boniface. The concept of just war depended upon more than a just reason underpinning a conflict. A just war also had to be defensive, had to be sanctioned by a legitimate authority, and fought for the right reasons. Biondo avoided characterizing the Fourth Crusade as explicitly defensive in his first narrative of events. But in the longer version of this paper, in his second account of the Fourth Crusade, he makes this very, very argument. He stresses the violence perpetrated against the Crusaders and then says, quote, "The Crusaders seized most just arms against the Greek tyrants." But he doesn't make that in his first, doesn't make that move in his first account. The narrative in the decades instead focused on the just motivations behind the crusading actions and their sanction by God. For example, after the Venetian colony of Zara rebelled, Biondo added information to his primary source to reinforce the piety of the Crusaders, especially Enrico Dandolo. In Lorenzo de Monachis' chronicle, the Venetian doge Enrico Dandolo promised ships and supplies to the Crusaders. After they arrived, they couldn't pay. Thus, De Monachis recorded that the nobles suggested an agreement to the Venetians. The Crusaders would give aid against Zara in exchange for the cancellation of their debts to the Venetians. A year passed, and the Crusaders embarked for Zara as agreed. Biondo, by contrast, sought to cement the altruism of Enrico Dandolo and the pious intention of the crusading army. Biondo followed Lorenzo de Monachis and stated that the French nobles arrived in Venice and could not meet their financial obligations to the Venetians, so they're the same to them. Biondo then added to Lorenzo de Monachis' narrative by claiming that the army waited at Venice for more people to arrive. This wait drained resources and lasted throughout the summer. Fall was upon the impoverished nobles and their Venetian hosts. According to Biondo, quote, by chance, the Venetian colony of Zara happened to rebel, and the Doge now needed the resources promised to the Crusaders to suppress the Zara rebellion. The Venetians, quote, in no way would permit that the inconvenience induced them to revoke their promise of support for the Crusade. So, Doge Enrico Dandolo was in a bind. He's promised all these ships for the holy purpose of retaking the Holy Land, but now this town and his empire has rebelled against him, so what is he going to do? He refuses to give up the promise he's made to the Crusades. He has to take care of his empire. So they make a deal. The Doge Enrico Dandolo and the French knights make a deal. Venice would forgive the debts of the Crusaders if the Crusaders would help suppressing the rebellion, or the uprising. Chance and the changing of seasons, both unique to Biondo's narrative, had forced Dandolo's hand. Dandolo, in turn, made an agreement with the French nobles that would allow them to pay their debts, the Venetians to keep their word while recovering their territory, and the Crusaders as a whole to get on with the business of retaking the Holy Land. The diversion was inescapable and temporary, while the Crusaders' actions were blameless. Biondo's argument about the pious motivation behind the Venetian and Frank actions continued after the Crusaders met Alexius IV at Zara. After the conquest of Zara, the changing season prevented the Crusaders' departure for the Holy Land. While the Crusaders awaited warmer weather, the boy Alexius, son of the deposed Greek emperor, arrived to request aid to retake Constantinople from his uncle, Alexius III. Lorenzo de Monachis followed Andrea Dandolo's chronicle verbatim for the offer proposed by Alexius IV. 30,000 marks for the Venetians. This is money owed to them by the emperor, a former Byzantine emperor. The money spent by the French for ships, and the reunion of the Greek and Latin churches. Biondo, by contrast, rearranges and sweetens the deal. Biondo moved the promised subjugation of the Greek to the Latin church to the first place on the list, so it used to be third and finally, now it's front and center. The rearrangement implicitly suggested that piety primarily motivated the Crusaders to assist Alexius. Money was a secondary concern, but even so, Biondo changed Alexius's offer. According to Biondo, Alexius offered to pay 30,000 marks not for some debt that the Byzantines had to the Venetians, but rather for hardships suffered by the French and the Venetians. So it's a way of exonerating the Venetians. The money was a payment for their services rather than a reimbursement to the Venetians. Finally, almost an afterthought, Alexius concluded with an offer to pay the debts owed by the French nobles to the Venetians. Holy motivations moved the Crusaders, and, as Biondo pointed out, God rewarded their piety by sanctioning their actions. A just reason, the right motivations, all that remained was for Biondo to demonstrate the sanctioning of events by a legitimate authority. Biondo argued that God provided this legitimacy. There's only a handful of powers that can offer legitimacy to an action. The emperor, if it's a legal emperor, the pope, or God. Biondo chooses God. In his narrative of the battle between Marsupials and the Crusaders, Biondo embellished the narrative found in the Chronicle of Lorenzo de Monachis in order to argue that the Crusaders possessed divine sanction for their attack on Constantinople. Lorenzo de Monachis had stated simply that, quote, divine judgment caused the Byzantine army to lose their icon of the Virgin Mary in the midst of a battle against a crusading host. Biondo embellished this simple statement. The humanists included, perhaps invented, a pre-battle ritual inside the city of Constantinople. He wrote that priests led a procession behind an icon of the Virgin and of the Greek army marched to the tune of divine songs. In essence, the priests sought to bless their icon and use it to attract divine favor in the upcoming battle. Following the ritual, the army rode out behind the consecrated icon. The Byzantines lost the battle and lost their icon. Instead of stating that divine judgment provided the icon to the Crusaders, Biondo argued that the Crusaders interpreted their seizure of the Byzantine icon is a sign from God. In fact, according to Biondo, the actor was not God, but misfortune. However, these changes mask the continuation of Biondo's argument that the Crusaders, armed with divine approval and a legal claim to rule the city, waged a just war against a tyrant. The ritual found in Biondo's account, but not in his source, was similar to rituals of crisis common in Italian city-states during the 15th century. So what I'm going to argue here is that throughout these cities, when you were confronted with a crisis like what Biondo is describing, Biondo more or less invents what he would expect to happen in the city if this were happening in Forli or in Venice. In a ritual designed to fend off an external crisis, a city generally sought out the most holy men and women in the city. Typically, the clergy recommended the government follow its advice to deliver large amounts of alms to the poor, to give charitable gifts, or to perform other types of charitable work. A sermon preceded a ritual procession through the city that lasted 1 to 3 days. The city's most powerful relic was brought forth and paraded through the streets before throngs of hopeful onlookers. In Biondo's version of this ritual, the Greeks drew up their battle lines for the fight ahead. Next, quote, the priests were sent forward and they advanced in a procession, carrying an icon of the glorious Virgin, Mother of God, which was kept in a shrine. Sacred songs went before the armed men about to go to battle. Upon the completion of the ritual, quote, the same icon was sent forward on a banner as battle standard. The Greeks had beseeched God for mercy and then led their intercessory tool into battle. Biondo's account implied that the Byzantines sought divine favor in the upcoming battle by appeasing God through ritual to atone for their sins. Biondo stressed their request through his inclusion of the ritual in his narrative. Yet, the Greeks lost the battle. God had rejected their ritual. Moreover, the Greeks lost their icon. It's surely not a coincidence that the icon fell into the hands of men under Baldwin of Flanders, the man soon to be elected emperor of the newly conquered Constantinople. Although hiding under the guise of casus, or chants in Latin, Biondo made God's judgment very clear. God had not only taken victory from the faithless Greeks and given it to the meritorious Crusaders, he'd also transferred their means of petitioning victory. In short, Biondo's insinuations that the Greeks were unsuccessful in attracting divine favor do not mesh with his attribution of the Greeks' loss of their icon because of bad luck. Biondo's narrative implied the same thing that his source had explicitly stated. God demonstrated his favor for the Latins by presenting them with the Byzantines' icon. God sanctioned the Fourth Crusade and the territorial claims based upon it. With God at their back, a claim to rule in hand, and a tyrant fleeing before them, the Crusaders marched into Constantinople, a sacking known to modern historians and reported even by Biondo's pro-Venetian source as a smorgasbord of vice and violence. One modern historian wrote, quote, for 3 days, the customary and accepted period of time for the sack of a conquered city, the victorious Latins feasted on the bloated corpse of New Rome. The crusading hosts and the Latin refugees were merged into a hideous mob driven by greed, lust, and hate. Biondo's primary source for this narrative, again Lorenzo de Monachi's, portrayed a similar scene. De Monachi's claimed that the Venetians scaled the walls of the city, which resounded with, quote, tears and weeping. Many people died as the French and the Venetians looted Constantinople. The Crusaders seized holy buildings, captured the pretender to the throne, and killed it. The people begged for mercy and, quote, the turmoil in the city subsided. Through these moves, Lorenzo de Monachi's chronicle followed other contemporary historians, particularly humanist historians, who sought to imitate classical models by describing the grief inflicted upon a besieged city. In opposition to contemporary historical trends and his primary source, Biondo omitted all references to the sacking of Constantinople. There are none. He wrote that the gates were thrown open. He did not provide an agent, and that, quote, peace was given to the city. Biondo's version took away a potential blemish on the otherwise meritorious record of the crusading armies. Additionally, Biondo portrayed a city that consented to be ruled by the crusading army rather than one that resisted the imposition of rule by a hostile force. The effect of the narrative was to establish a legitimate claim for Latin Christians to rule over the Greek mainland and islands, much of which had been or was possessed by Venice, all of which was in the possession of or threatened by the Ottoman Turks in the mid-15th century. Despite the large territorial gains from the fall of Constantinople in 1204, Venice quickly lost effective control of its overseas holdings. The rebellion of Crete in 1363-65 marked the low point of the emperor's fortune. From the latter 14th to the mid-15th centuries, the Venetians reestablished their vast maritime empire. Starting in the 1380s and lasting throughout the 15th 14th century, they took much of Dalmatia and parts of Greece, including several Greek islands. The means by which the Venetians acquired their territory varied, as did their legal justification for each. Within this empire, Crete enjoyed a special status due to the large population of descendants of 13th century Venetian colonists. Not coincidentally, Crete, the Greek archipelago, so the islands that Venice is struggling to hold on to, Crete, and the portion of Constantinople were the areas that Biondo highlights, were given to the Venetians after the end of the Fourth Crusade. As the Venetians reestablished the control over these lands, Biondo's narrative provided a legitimate historical claim for Venice over these lands. They received this claim from their participation in the just legal conquest of Constantinople in the 13th century. This defense of Venetian claims fit into a broader context of papal crusading efforts in the early 1440s. At the same time as Biondo argued that the Fourth Crusade legitimized Latin conquest in the East, his patron and friend, Pope Eugenius IV, was piecing together a new crusade to aid the Greeks in Constantinople before pressing into the Holy Land. The Pope, emboldened by victories over the Council of Bantal, the final reunification of the Greek, Armenian, and Ethiopian churches, and political as well as military victories on the Italian peninsula, had already begun preparations for the crusade before the conclusion of the Council of Florence in 1442. Venetians were the key to the success. In 1442, the Venetians wrote to Giuliano Cesarini, papal representative to the crusading army, that the Pope was not meeting his financial obligations for the planned fleet to the east. By the next year, the financial situation had begun to improve. On January 1st, 1443, Eugenius made a European-wide call for the defense of the Greeks. Money came in, and work on the fleet advanced in Venice. On May 8, 1443, the Pope sent his nephew, Francesco Condolar, to Greece to command the fleet that would supplement the crusading army amassing in Central Europe. By July, Venice declared that it had spent 30,000 ducats on the fleet, the same number that Alexius IV had offered to pay them in the Fourth Crusade. The Venetians had outfitted and manned around 20 galleys, with the arms largely paid for by attacks on the Venetian clergy. Venetian and papal cooperation combined with resources in Eastern Europe to bring success out on all fronts. The armies of John Hunyadi pushed the Turks back in Transylvania. Further south, Greek armies under Constantine Dagasis began reconsolidating the Byzantine position in Greece. By late 1443, the crusading army, accompanied by the papal legate Giuliano Cesarini, wintered in Buda. The Venetians wrote the army in January of 1444 to congratulate them upon their victories in the advance of the Christian forces. Peace with the Sultan was rejected in May, because they're very, very confident now. Alliances were solidified and plans for a summer march against the Turks were made. The crusading fleet sailed from Venice. Sometime amidst the excitement of these years, Biondo Flavio used the Fourth Crusade to demonstrate that the Latin Christians, particularly Eugenius IV and the Venetians, were fighting in defense of their claims to eastern lands, now ruled by tyrants, and as such conducted a just war. In November of 1444, the Turks decimated the crusading army at Varna, destroying the hope of Latin Christians, including Biondo Flavio, that the new crusade would end in a success mirroring their ancestors in the Fourth Crusade. Perhaps the defeat of the crusading army in 1444 disillusioned Biondo, but perhaps Biondo's estrangement from the papal curia after the death of Eugenius IV in 1447 pushed him away from the history of the Fourth Crusade. He did not return to the events until 1453, and two treatises discussed in the longer version of his paper. In each of Biondo's three different narratives of the Fourth Crusade, the humanist historian sought to establish the legitimacy of claims by Italian states to Byzantine and then Ottoman lands, at times of particularly strong crusading fervor in Western Europe. The years directly after the Council of Florence, and as shown in the longer version, the immediate aftermath of the fall of Constantinople, and the immediate response to the Peace of Lodi. Each time, Biondo's historical narrative coincided with papal diplomacy and aimed to launch a new crusade that would, hopefully, emulate the past successes of crusaders and reassert Latin claims to illegally usurped lands. The Fourth Crusade had ended with the establishment of prosperous Latin kingdoms in the East. As such, it provided a model for 15th century princes and republics to emulate. Even more importantly, an historical basis for their claims to conquer territories. According to Biondo Flavio, the heirs of these kingdoms possessed legal claim to Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. 15th century crusaders could, therefore, retake what was rightfully theirs in the East. By pressing their claims, the modern-day crusaders would repulse the Ottoman Turks, who were the latest barbarians intent on destroying Christendom. Biondo spun his version of the Fourth Crusade 3 different times for 3 different audiences over roughly a decade. Each time he rearranged, suppressed, inserted, and may have even invented historical information to make arguments designed to urge powerful Italian rulers to take back what was rightfully theirs by fighting a just war against barbarian hordes and tyrannical usurpers. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
Do you think, so this trend of historians kind of embellishing or changing the story to kind of fit whatever purpose they had, was Flavio one of the first people to do this, or was this a trend that had already been going on with historians in the past? Do you find it later historians, 50, 100 years later?
I think later historians, absolutely. Particularly when you get into formalized Latin historians, you're going to find that these elements exist in, say, an informal chronicle. So you're a monk in your monastery and you're recording things by the day or by the year. You're going to have less of a vested interest in presenting a very particular point of view. That's not to say that you don't have a point of view to project. You do. But it's not going to be the same type of overarching goal that I would argue it is for Biondo Flavio. This is just one case study, and I would imagine a systematic investigation of the decades as a whole would see this time after time after time after time. In terms of whether he's the first, no. No, he's not. I see this as consistent before him. In terms of after him, absolutely. And I'd say it becomes more frequent afterwards, simply because these formalized Latin official histories become more frequent and more, there's more of them as you go.
Did any of the Italian leaders, did they understand that it was possible for him to inject bias, or did they see these as kind of like official manuscripts that this is what happened this time?
It's impossible to say. I mean, it's a question of what, if Eugenius IV, if you were to read this, what would he say? I think they would see it as true from their point of view, would be what I'd say. But that's all speculative. I think Eugenius IV would view the Fourth Crusade as primarily he's the Venetian and he's the Pope. He would see it as we were just in doing this, and this history confirms that. Rather than starting today, where you would set up an historical argument and then sort of talk about it, this would be, we know we were just in the Fourth Crusade, now let's see it. Yes, please.
Who was Flavio's intended audience? Who was he trying to convince with all this?
This is a very contested question. Traditionally, historians would talk about Biondo Flavio and others like him writing for a very small academic clique, a republic of letters. Maybe you've had a seminar with me, I've railed against this. Talking about maybe 8 to 10 different people that read your Latin history, a handful of rulers. And I would argue against this claim. I think that, and the book that I have under review makes this argument, I think, very clearly, that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are primarily upper class. You can find these types of people into lower echelons of society, but primarily rich men, some women, who would be interested in reading a work like Biondo Flavio. Biondo's history is read by all of the leading thinkers, and I would also argue these people who admired them and liked reading the books. Yeah.
So the intended audience of that size, how many of these books were meticulously handwritten and copied out? Is it one book floating around between all these people, or several hundred, or did he speak out loud to audiences in some cases, or a combination of all of it?
A combination of all of it. Biondo's decades exist in, I mean, it's a question of how many of them circulate at one given time. So how many of them circulate in the 1450s, for example? These arguments are very recurrent in the 1440s. You're not talking about a ton of them, but you are talking about people borrowing and reading each other's manuscripts a lot. That's how you would own a manuscript copy, but you would also lend it far as freely as we lend books today, more or less. So, if you have 30 handwritten copies of it, some of them could be publicly available. Many of them would be available through friends for you to read. So, I would say any person in Venice, at the papal court, at the court of King Alfonso of Naples, with an interest in reading this text, they could read the text. If they had an interest in it, they would have heard it. And the other question is, the information also gets transferred in other ways. The Fourth Crusade appears 3 different times. So you have to count the circulation of all 3 of those different manuscripts to get more or less exactly the same argument 3 different times from 3 different people. Other questions? Yes?
Are there any examples of like contemporaries of Biondo that may have forgotten his material, or may have the source material, or that kind of call him on his mistakes, or try to find his mistakes?
Yes, there are. I mean, when Biondo dies, he is Pius II. So Biondo has Pius II will become Pope in 1458. He'll try to get a crusade going, like they all try to get. He'll actually die on crusade in 1464. But before he dies, he writes a compendium of Biondo's decades and just trashes Biondo throughout it, talking about how Biondo was loose with facts and his style particularly was awful. His style was horrible. And so what he tries to do is say there's some useful stuff here if I shorten it up and improve the style a bit. And I've compared Pius II's compendium version of this with Biondo's, and it doesn't seem to really have changed much. But again, he's the Pope. There's no reason for it to change. Another question, we look at rival interpretations of the Fourth Crusade. The Venetians are very, very much in line with Biondo, of course. It's a very pro-Venetian account. There are some differences in the particulars. I don't know what the French are arguing exactly because they have a strong vested interest in this. But most of the Italian city-states don't have a vested interest in how these things go. Histories of Florence pass over this very, very briefly because they don't have a strong contingent in the Fourth Crusade. They don't have an empire over there. Alfonso of Naples, Biondo will try to create a claim for him in one of these later works, but he's not really interested in laying claim to this. Milan certainly is not. So there's the problem to get into. What do they see as relevant to their history? Other questions? Well, thank you all very much for coming out on a Monday evening.